Welcome to The Power of Now What, a podcast on overcoming the various problems and challenges that one encounters when on the spiritual path, when on a spiritual journey, when engaged in a practice such as meditation or other spiritual discipline, and even post awakening, post the enlightenment experience itself. This is episode 9 on the issue of spiritual bypassing. The problem of spiritual bypassing, which is quite a nice problem to have, actually. If you've encountered it, it is quite a nice problem to have. I'll explain why in a moment. I'd like to discuss what spiritual bypassing is, why it's potentially a problem. I'd also like to talk about what is not spiritual bypassing, and hopefully I can give a bit of a solution or some perspectives how, in my experience, one can approach this particular issue. It's a hotly debated issue. It comes up quite a lot in spiritual circles. It's often discussed, and I mean, it can be quite a controversial one. It does cause some arguments and some tension. So let's see if we can't pick this apart a little bit. So, spiritual bypassing, why is it quite a nice problem to have? Well, I mean, it's as with some of these problems in spirituality, it is a sign. If you've come across it, it's a sign you're doing something right. It's not a sign that you're doing something wrong, because it means that your meditation or your practice is working. I mean, the danger really of spiritual bypassing is because meditation is so effective. It works so incredibly well to alleviate the suffering that is caused by your problems. And spiritual bypassing, by the way, can refer to both the external world and the internal world. So it might mean using meditative practice and spiritual disciplines as a way of ignoring your problems, external and internal. It can mean it's like a checking out, just becoming disengaged and disinterested, and simply a form of running away from your problems. And this is what's referred to often as spiritual bypassing. It's a get around. It's a way of just not dealing with life because you found a spiritual path now. You found meditation. And so you just checked out. I'm out of here. See you later, losers. I'm just going to go spend time as infinite universal conscious now. I am not interested in dealing with taxes and pensions and work, life, relationships, my kids. I just ain't interested. I'm checked out. So that is essentially what is meant by spiritual bypassing. Those are like the external problems. Internally, there can be this issue of, well, you may have some deeper psychological and psychiatric concerns and issues that do need to be addressed, that need attention, and could really do with some input and some action. And one can quite easily fall into the trap through meditative practices of ignoring those issues. So, I'm going to speak a little about my experiences with that as well, and just give an overview of what this subject is, because it's fascinating. It's a very fascinating subject, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time contemplating and trying to get my head around and understand, because psychiatric and deep mental health issues are definitely something that you can't ignore. I tried for a very long time. And well, firstly, I spent 10 years trying to drink it away, and realized that. So I tried to drown my demons, only to realize that my demons can swim. And then I tried to run away from my problems by engaging in so much exercise and sort of engaging in fitness, and tried to run away from my problems. And eventually just came to this deep realization that you're gonna have to face it at some point. I don't know if you know the old story of the bear hunt. It's a children's story, but it's a very good one to teach children. When you come up against an obstacle, you can't go over it, you can't go around it, you can't go under it. You'll have to go through it. And I'm a big believer in that now. However, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the problems with that as well, but that's a little bit later on. So here's what happens in meditation. This is a very common journey and path that people who begin a spiritual journey come up against, is that in the early days, so most often or very commonly, people have these troubles psychologically. They have anxiety, depression, maybe triggered by a very stressful or traumatic life event, or just over the course of life realizing that you have some sort of mental health concerns, that it's time to start taking a look at. You maybe just realize, look, I always have this anxiety. I always have this deep sadness in me, and it's been there my whole life. And then as you get into adult life, you go, right, it's time to take a look at this. And if that's you, well done. Well done. Do it. Get on top of it. It's time to really let's get this fixed. Let's get this sorted. It's one of the most beneficial things you can do for yourself and the world around you is take a look at your mental health. And we do various different practices, as I detailed in the previous podcast, about how to overcome our mental health issues using conventional methods. And sometimes people, through this, maybe they go to CBT, they speak to doctors, they speak to therapists, and go online and start getting into the mental health space online, eventually coming up to meditation and meditative practices. And that's when you go, that's interesting. There's some idea here of sitting still, focusing on my breath. And when I have these anxious and dark thoughts arising, just ignore them. Just, I can focus my attention elsewhere. And by focusing my attention elsewhere, I'm no longer lost in a stream of thoughts. I'm no longer lost and caught up in all the stories, all of the narratives in my mind, all of this dark, horrible feeling that the anxiety and depression and stress is causing. And now I'm beginning to focus my consciousness and my attention elsewhere. Now, in the early days, this it takes a lot of effort. It really does. It takes a lot of strain to sit there, even for 5 minutes, because our thoughts feel so busy and our feelings feel so raw and immediate. And in the early, it's very common to go, this is ridiculous. This is impossible. This does not work. It's not possible to sit here and focus on something else. My mind is too loud. So in the early days, it feels like ignoring thought is impossible. And the idea of a spiritual bypass is like, well, hey, that'd be nice. I don't have that problem. I have the opposite problem. The more I try to sit and meditate, the more involved in my problems I feel, because I'm trying to get away from them and they just seem to get louder and louder. It's all part of the process, team. Keep going. It's all part of the process. If that's you at that stage, just keep at the practice, because eventually you start to go, that's interesting. I think I'm beginning to get it. And I remember from my experiences here, the first time I had that experience, it's giving me goosebumps even just talking about it now. I've got goosebumps thinking about it, because I was sat in my room. I'd had to move in with my parents because I'd had a huge mental breakdown, and I was in the worst period of my life. One of them. I've had quite a few. I've had some bad periods. I've had a number of mental breakdowns, but this was one of the first ones, and the first time's the hardest. So I was sat in my room. I was going through alcohol withdrawal, and I was engaged in a process of really trying to sort my life out. And meditation was one of those things that I was trying because some people had recommended it. The CBT practitioner, she'd recommended it. And I bought this book called Finding Peace in a Frantic World. This is not product placement, by the way. I'm just telling you this was my experience. And it had some guided meditations. And I was listening on this CD, a CD with this. I'm showing my age now. And I was listening on my headphones in my room. And I was trying this practice day in, day out. And I was going, this is ridiculous. I'm just sat here worrying. I'm just sat here feeling low and depressed. And then all of a sudden, during one random meditation, one day, suddenly my thoughts subsided. And this was the first time that I can remember in my entire life that I experienced moments without thinking. It fell away, and I was vaguely aware that thoughts were continuing, but it felt like I'd stepped out of a raging river, which previously I was caught up in the rapids of this intense psychological distress. And for the first time in my adult life, I'd stepped out. And this was without drugs, this was without alcohol. I wasn't doing any fitness training at that particular moment. And the feeling was incredible. Because the other thing that struck me, the insight that hit me there is, so I can do this in my room on my own. I don't need anyone around. I don't need the therapist there. I can do this on my own. All I need is my breath and my consciousness. And that's always going to be with me. If I don't have my breath and my consciousness, I probably have bigger problems than anxiety and depression at that point. But as long as I'm conscious and breathing, I can focus my attention on the breath. And the relief that was a huge part of the issue just fell away. So this happens in meditation. You go, I think I'm getting it. And the more I practiced, the longer these periods of peace and calm began to pervade through my system, began to pervade through my mind. So I started to get it. I started to understand. And this happens commonly in a lot of people on a meditative journey. And it happens further down the line, I would suggest. Maybe it happens quite rapidly in other people, but for me, in my experience, it happened further down the line that I started to be able to go entire days just feeling totally free, open, empty, spacious, and clear. And any troublesome thought that came up was a piece of cake to just ignore. That's how much meditation I'd been doing at the time. And I mean, the relief from this was so intense. It was massive. I mean, just imagine, I'd been an alcoholic for 10 years. Like, I was in absolute agony psychologically for as long as I could remember. And finally, I'd found something that worked. And so I didn't engage with the anxious thoughts or the depressed thoughts for a long time. And then it wasn't until a lot later, once, the rest of my life started to kind of fall into place, which is something that happens. I was happier in my work, happier in myself, happier in my physical health and fitness. You do this meditation so much, you start to go, hang on a minute. I wonder if maybe I'm a little bit too checked out. And this is where we start to come up against the problem or the concern, the interest in the issue of something called spiritual bypassing, because we say, I wonder, I wonder if maybe I shouldn't check out of these thoughts entirely. Maybe I shouldn't completely disengage from every thought, because after all, our thoughts must be there for a reason. We must have feelings for a reason. But once you are so established in the full present moment, you've fully disengaged from the sense of being an individual, temporary, finite ego, and instead abiding as infinite universal consciousness, you start to realize, well, hang on a minute, I could actually stop thinking entirely. But that presents a little bit of an issue. It's like, well, won't I miss something? Won't I miss things? What happens then? am I not spiritually bypassing? Maybe there are problems happening in my life, in and around my life, and maybe they need a bit more attention than I'm giving them. And maybe there are some internal issues with spiritual bypassing. No, there's some maybe there's some internal issues with my mental health, and I'm bypassing those issues. So, when you finally come up against having a choice, for one thing, like I say, this is a sign you've done something right. And it's a nice problem to have, because now you can choose, well, which thoughts do I engage with then? Which problems do I engage with? Well, now you've got a choice. So that's it. You've done it. You're liberated now that you have the choice. So, in my experience, yes, I was totally checked out at times. And, maybe part of that is just I needed some time. I needed some time, space, and peace away from the source of the stress, for partly to just feel like life is worth living after all. And it's sometimes, like, if somebody if somebody broke their leg and goes to A&E, and they're screaming in agony because they've got a full fracture of their femur or something like that, the doctor wouldn't say, well, don't bother giving them any morphine, because the morphine's not going to fix the problem. The problem is the broken leg. The problem's not the pain, so don't bother with the morphine. No. First, alleviate suffering. That is like a core tenet of the medical profession. First, alleviate suffering. So don't get too involved or interested in the spiritual bypassing phenomena too soon in your journey. If you found something that alleviates your suffering, go all in and give yourself a break, right? Give yourself a breather. Don't start worrying about whether you should do this, whether you should know. Forget that. Forget that. If you found something that's finally taking the psychological pain away, do it. Do it. We'll get to the deeper stuff later. We'll fix the broken leg later. Right now, we need to get you out of pain, because when you're in pain, that's when you act in ways that cause more pain. When you are suffering psychologically, your life is going to be a disaster until you found something that alleviates the pain. As with that analogy of somebody who's broken their leg, now that they're under the morphine, they stop writhing around so much, and the surgeon can do the job that the surgeon needs to do. Okay? So, first, alleviate pain would be my first recommendation. That would be my first thing. If you've come up against, am I spiritual bypassing? Don't worry about it until you really need to worry about it. So, in my experience, yes, I probably was a bit too checked out, disengaged, disinterested, because I was ignoring some of the deeper aspects of my shadow. I'll do an entire episode on shadow work later, but I was vaguely aware that there was a deeper, darker part of my emotions and thoughts that I didn't dare go anywhere near. I was afraid to go near it, because I knew I'd taken care of a lot of the surface level stuff. I'd taken care of the physical. I'd taken care of the addiction. I'd taken care of some of the more surface level anxieties. So now I can function in the world as a normal. The jury might still be out on that one, but I would consider myself to be normal. Well, yeah, we'll see. But I was functioning then as a normal human being, and so I'd taken care of some of the surface level stuff through various practices such as meditation, therapy, exercise, AVRT, and so, because those surface level things had been stripped away, now the deeper, darker aspect of the shadow was beginning to rise. But I needed a break from doing all this self development, so I kind of left it. And my meditative practice had been so powerful, I started to think, well, maybe I can avoid it altogether. This is like Gandalf ignoring the Balrog for a long time, and eventually he had to go and deal with it. So that's what spiritual bypassing is and why it's potentially a problem. Because when you can avoid painful feelings through meditative practice, you run the risk of falling into the same old trap of avoiding uncomfortable feelings. When we avoid uncomfortable feelings, we are strengthening the ego. We strengthen the sense of being an individual, temporary, finite, separate self. So that's that in a large part, that's what the ego is. That's what our illusion of being a person is. It's an attempt to avoid the reality of the situation. And in my case, the reality of the situation was, yes, there was some deep issues of childhood trauma that were buried so deep that I was not conscious of them. Through the meditative practice, I'd managed to continue to avoid those deeper problems precisely because they're painful. So, why is this an issue? Because in order to heal, we have to feel. This is so crucial, so crucial. To heal from the problem, we have to feel the problem. You won't be able to clean the messy room with the light still off. You'll just keep bumping into stuff and making it even more messy. We have to turn the light on in order to deal with the issue. So, in order to heal the issue, we have to feel the issue. And this takes a little time. I'll put this in the later part of this this podcast as the overcoming, the solution to the spiritual bypassing, because that's why it's a problem. In order to heal, we need to feel. And when meditative practice is so powerful that you can disappear, there's you have less you have less and less inclination to feel these painful feelings. I mean, for me, when I'm deeply in it, when I'm really in my I'm in my present blissful state, it's like I'm immersed in a large, infinitely vast, but also infinitely small cloud of peace. But it's not even a cloud, it's nothing. It's the space in which the cloud appears and the cloud itself. It's like a fine, grey, cool, calm mist. And there is a colourless, ever present, shining light that again exists and doesn't exist. And there's this rainbow halo and a corona around this light. And I can stay in that for it's hard to pull myself back into personhood when you my god when you're there. It's hard to come back sometimes, and I don't want to come back and deal with my childhood trauma because I'm having a great time here with God, thank you. But eventually, you just realize, because deep in meditative states, this thing won't leave you alone. The darkness won't leave you alone. The really deep stuff is going to keep coming back until you look at it. It's very much like a child or an animal. It doesn't know any better, and it will keep tugging at you until you give it some attention. So the problem, in theory, of spiritual bypassing is that you're not paying attention to that internal deep darkness because you have the option to walk away. It's also referring to when you have problems in your everyday life. That's a bit more surface level, and I guess I haven't encountered that as much. And that's a very real thing. We don't want people to check out. I mean, I say we. Who am I even referring to? Who is this we? um, So, it wouldn't be a good idea if somebody, I don't know, they find dealing with their children stressful, and so they just sort of meditate and don't engage with their children. That's not right, is it? You find work stressful, and so you just start kind of phoning it in. You don't put any effort into work anymore. Your car's breaking down, so you just ignore the warning light. That is spiritual bypassing in a nutshell. The engine light comes on in your car and you don't bother dealing with it, and then the problem gets worse. As you awaken and enlighten, you realize that ignoring the problem is egoic in itself. Ignoring the problem is the ego. Ignoring the problem isn't what infinite universal consciousness does, because infinite universal consciousness is never afraid, it's never tired, it's never bored, it's never exhausted. So it can deal with any issue that arises immediately. And if you're doing it right, if there is such a thing, you will deal with your problems quicker the more you awaken, the more you enlighten, the quicker you deal with your problems. If you find you're ignoring your problems and they keep getting worse, that's probably a sign that you are falling into the trap of bypassing. So there's the external and internal. And yeah, I would say the more you awaken, the more you enlighten, the more you will naturally deal with your problems quicker. I would like to talk about what is not spiritual bypassing. What doesn't count as spiritual bypassing? We have to remember the promise of the meditative practice is a place of peace, a place of serenity, a place where the problems, internal and external, aren't really a problem anymore. They just subside into the background of a continual, ever-evolving process, an event, an experience that unfolds. And if you find this space of peace, you will know it. There will be no doubt in your mind when you finally feel it. And some people don't like that. So some people don't like it when you find peace, you find happiness, because they're invested in you being an ego. And the reason people don't like it when you find inner peace is because happy people are very hard to manipulate. I talk about some dark topics on this podcast, and that is one of them. The world, Maya, the illusion, the matrix, cannot stand it when you are happy, when you are at peace. And you are going to have so much attempts to pull you off of this path. Internally, externally, it doesn't matter. It will come in so many forms. The happier you get, the more insidious the forms of attempt at distraction will become. And one of the ways in which the Maya, low consciousness, unconscious people, the agents from the matrix, one of the ways that they pull you away from the spiritual path is to guilt trip you into abandoning your peace by saying, oh, you're spiritual bypassing. Don't know why they talk like that. That's always the way they talk in my experience. People, oh, you're just ignoring your problems. You're just ignoring the world's problems. You're not doing it right. Oh, fuck off. Oh, honestly, people cannot stand it when you're happy. You'll see this, which is why I would recommend, if you have found peace and happiness, be careful who you tell. Be careful who you talk to about it, because you're going to get a lot of interest, and not all of it is going to be positive. Most of it will be negative. So it's not spiritual bypassing. Like, enlightenment itself is not spiritual bypassing. Awakening to your true nature is not spiritual bypassing. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. There's no real such thing as spiritual bypassing. What there is ego. There is identification with the individual, temporary, finite, separate self that is afraid and filled with desire. That's the problem, is the false identification. So anytime that you're identifying as the temporary separate self, you're going in the wrong direction. The more awakened and enlightened and at peace you are, the more you stop generating new problems, you find better solutions to your current problems internally and externally. So don't let people manipulate you. It's like people saying like, oh, you need to do this work for me for free. Oh, now that you're all meditative and stuff, you're not going to continue to prop me up and feed my ego, because you're no longer feeding people's ego. I'm not going to prop you up anymore. I'm not going to keep not going to keep pouring energy into a false world that doesn't give you any energy back. What's the point? What is the point? You're going to be far more helpful to other people if you're at peace and happy yourself. I'll talk more on that on the subject of how to deal with the problem of suffering in the world. We'll do that at a later date. So be aware of just how manipulative people can be, because a lot of the time people don't want you to be happy, because happy people are so difficult to manipulate. You have no desire or fear anymore. And if you don't have desire or fear, people can't make you help them move house. They can't force you into a box anymore. You're out. I'm out of the matrix. Sorry, Agent Smith. I'm done. See ya. Smell you later. So on the subject of trying to get people to do stuff for you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. That helps me out massively trying to grow the channel and this podcast a little bit. All you have to do is just whack that subscribe button. Cheers. So we have talked about what spiritual bypassing is and why it's a problem. We've looked at the issue of when meditation's so effective, you have the option of disengaging from problems, and looked at what spiritual bypassing is not. After all, we're trying to get to a point where we don't have problems anymore. That is the truly awakened state. Because infinite universal consciousness can't have problems. It doesn't have problems to bypass. It's the recognition and realization that there aren't any problems. Everything is one. And the concept of problems is an illusion. It's in the same way that a tree in a forest that needs to grow taller to reach the light because of the other trees around, it's just doing what it does naturally. It's a naturally unfolding process. But from the perspective of the tree, it has a problem. It can't feel the sunlight. So it would feel like it has a problem. If it had a neocortex, it would feel like it has a problem. From an outside perspective, we can see it doesn't have a problem. This is just a natural process unfolding. If you can zoom out from your own ego identification, you see that all of your problems are exactly the same. It's just a natural process unfolding. No matter what the nature of the problem is, problems at work, problems in your marriage, problems with your kids, problems with your health, it's only an issue. It's only suffering if you've identified as a temporary finite ego. It's not a problem if you zoom out to consciousness and recognize that you are the tree trying to grow taller so that it can reach the light. It is not spiritual bypassing to attain a level of consciousness that sees the reality of the situation. However, the way I see it, you have inner work to do. I do believe that each individual body and mind must work through their shadow, the darkness that resides within everyone, the sticky, deep, the early laid down traumas, the pain, the throughout your entire ego identified life. You were generating this darkness, this pain, this horror. And my God, does it get dark. Believe me, I generated a lot of it for myself and then tried to disappear and disengage from the whole thing, eventually coming back to go, you know what? Maybe it's just time to take out the bins. Maybe it's just time to clean the room once and for all. Let's get it done. And I believe that's what happens when it's your final incarnation on this earth. When you're about to leave the wheel of samsara, you're actually about to do it. You are at the final gate. You are ready to step out completely. St. Peter says there's just you you need to wipe your feet before you come into heaven. That's it. Would you mind wiping your feet before you get into heaven? We can't have any negative karma in the land of bliss, because the land of bliss is the place without that shadow. That's what it is. So before you leave, you have to just do the last bit of cleaning. And I think a lot of people get stuck here because they go for a long time on their spiritual path, on their spiritual discipline, on their spiritual journey, feeling lighter and lighter and becoming more and more aware of that very deep, dark bit that they just don't want to come to. And it's a shame, because if you just got that last little bit done, the stink would go. Take the bins out and the smell will go. Why clean the entire kitchen but not take out the bins? Why do a mountain of washing up and leave one cup? Don't leave one cup. Do the whole thing. Clear it all. Now, I will say, as a compassionate concession, to use a Rupert Spirit term, a compassionate concession, I do believe it takes some time. I think not that there is such thing as time, classic paradox, but it does. It takes some evolution. It takes some experience. Because as you develop in spirituality, as your body mind becomes accustomed to meditative practice, it gets stronger. It gets more able to process quickly deeper and darker aspects of your psyche. Body, mind, and world. The more you elevate in consciousness, the more stuff is going to rise up, because it can be seen. Now it can be dealt with safely. It's like to use the computer game analogy again. It's like you don't just, if you develop your character to have stronger weapons and magic abilities and stuff, you don't stay on the same level. It would be boring. There'd be no point. You don't just repeat level 1 over and over again and just get better and better at it. Once you've developed better weapons and armor, you move on to the next level. And that's what happens in spirituality. And I mean this literally as well. There is a form of it being a battle. The more you develop your spirit, your body, mind, soul, consciousness, whatever you want to call this weird individual being, because there's something here, the more it develops and expands and elevates in light and consciousness, the more powerful it becomes. And the more powerful it becomes, the bigger chunks of grime and garbage that we can burn away. But you don't go straight, when you're a level 1 character, you don't go straight to the end of the computer game and try to take out the final boss. It's going to take some getting there. This is the progressive path. There's the direct path and the progressive path, but it does take a bit of time. Immersed in consciousness, experience the bliss of inner peace, and the body and mind will begin to become healthier internally in the mind and the psyche and the body. But as it does, new things will begin to arise. So your body mind can only take so much. It's hard work on your body and mind to process pain. It is. It's hard work, and it takes time to heal. And I believe it processes a chunk, digests a chunk of the darkness, and then it's on to the next bit. And maybe occasionally what happens is your body and mind comes across a chunk that it can't deal with just yet. It's too much. A very deep old memory might resurface. It's a common problem in meditation. An old, ancient, painful memory suddenly arrives in your consciousness, and it's a bit much. Maybe you haven't quite reached the level of strength, or you don't have the circumstances in your life to deal with that particular part of the shadow. And so we can just maybe just skirt it for a little while and just go back into the land of bliss and stay there for a lot longer until the body mind is able to deal with the next chunk. That's going to protect you from spiritual bypassing. As with a lot of these problems and challenges that arise, with everything, awareness is key. Awareness is key. Problems cannot really exist if you continually place the beam of awareness, the pure laser beam of consciousness on the problem. You keep it on there for long enough, it's going to disappear eventually. Awareness is the key. And sometimes if you're aware, right, I've got a big problem psychologically or externally as well in your everyday life, right, I've got this big issue. I've got a problem with my kids, and like there's big problems. Like, what if there's a problem at work that you can't really ignore, but you don't have the strength to deal with just yet? As long as you're aware that that's what's happening, you're still in a process of healing. You're still in a process of moving forwards. It's only when you ignore a problem that's when it's dangerous. That's when we do unhealthy things. That's when we're not healing, is when you fully ignore it and you become unconscious. By definition, you become unconscious. But if you place your consciousness on the problem, even if you know deep down, I can't deal with this just yet. I'm not strong enough. I don't have the resources. I will come back to this later. That's not spiritual bypassing in my book. In my book, that's just being smart. That's just approaching the problem with reason, love, and intelligence. Because we need to be loving towards ourselves. We have to be. Lord knows we have been hard on ourselves for long enough. You've been beating yourself up for long enough. You've been feeling like you need to work harder for long enough. If you found a way of being at peace and happy, if that means I will deal with the deeper psychological issue later, I want to enjoy playing with God for a while first. Do it. Do it. That is not spiritual bypassing. As long as you're aware the issue is there, you'll get to it when you get to it. And when it's time to get to it, believe me, it's going to hurt. So spend as much time as you need preparing. That's not spiritual bypassing. And a lot of the time, people will accuse you. Be aware that this is coming. People will accuse you of spiritual bypassing. Ignore them. They don't know you. They don't know what you've experienced in your life. They don't know anything about you. They don't know you from Adam or Eve, literally. So if people accuse you of spiritual bypassing, you know what to say to them. You know where they can get off. And develop the deep intuition. And you can always ask yourself, are you sure? Ask yourself, am I bypassing, or am I just being compassionate towards myself? When you have the strength and the resources, we're going to clean the whole room. We'll get right down to it. We'll clean the whole dang thing. Until then, enjoy the ride. Enjoy it. Don't forget to enjoy your life. And the moment you start to enjoy your life and be at peace, people will say, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. Because misery loves company, let me tell you. Oof, oi, oi, oi. So, That's a brief overview of spiritual bypassing, what it is, and a few of my experiences with it. And as with everything, it's not really an issue after all. When you really get down to it, I mean, you have an infinite amount of time, and this shadow will process eventually. You know, when the sun starts to rise, the shadows have to disappear. Simple as that. Stay the course. Keep doing what you're doing. You're crushing it. All right. Spiritual bypassing, not spiritual bypassing, up, down, left, right, yes, no, day, night, whatever. It's all a beautiful experience unfolding in consciousness. One more thing. I will address further down the line the problem of suffering in the world and how that we address it once we have begun to awaken. It's been requested, and it's a very good question. If I'm infinite universal consciousness and fully present, do I just ignore the problems in the world? And this is sometimes called spiritual bypassing. You sometimes get accused of that if because people say, well, yeah, how can you ignore the injustice, the suffering, the grief, the trauma, the abuse that goes on around you? You can't just ignore that just because you found peace. And people will say, oh, you're just spiritually bypassing the problems in the world. But I'm gonna have to just that's a big subject, and it's going to require a long podcast to discuss and get to. So I can't really go into the spiritual bypassing of that particular issue in the scope of this talk podcast, whatever you want to call it. So I'll get to that later. This one was more about the internal world and addressing your own problems. And yeah, it's been talked about, the rest of it. So that is the spiritual bypass. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate every single one of you. I am so heartened by the response to this podcast. It's just growing and growing and growing, and I've got plans to do more and more, and I've got big plans for how I'm going to develop and move this on. Please remember to like and subscribe. It helps me out massively. I need to grow the channel, and the main metric that they look at is subscribers, likes, and watch hours. So thank you. If you've watched this far, you've done me a huge favor already. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It does help me out massively. You can find me on Spotify as well. You can find me on Instagram, Corin_Bryant underscore. You can find me on Facebook, Corin Bryant, meditation coach and personal trainer. Obviously, you find me on YouTube. You're listening on YouTube. That's everything. That's everything. Thank you so much for listening, team. Take care, be well, and stay present.